Reverend Caleb Williams stood before the slightly cracked mirror in the rectory of the small, weathered church he had led for 30 years, his trembling hands adjusting the silk tie he had bought specifically for this day. It was supposed to be the crowning moment of his life, the day he would stand beside his only son, Daniel, and bless a union that promised a bright future. But as he looked at his reflection, at the gray hair that crowned his head and the deep lines etched into his dark skin by years of service and sacrifice, he felt a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach, a premonition that something was about to break. He had spent his entire life preaching about the prodigal son, about forgiveness and the unbreakable bond of family. But he never imagined that he would be the one standing on the precipice of a heartbreak so profound it would shake the very foundations of his faith. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we dive into this emotional tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and the inevitable swing of justice, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from New York, Lagos, London, or perhaps somewhere in the Philippines? We want to know. The morning sun was struggling to pierce through the heavy clouds as Caleb stepped out of the rectory and walked toward his old, reliable sedan. The car had seen better days, much like the church building behind him, but it ran, and that was all that mattered. Today, he wasn't driving to a hospital visit or a prayer meeting. He was driving to the Grand Oakhaven Estate, a sprawling venue on the other side of the city where the wealthy and elite played. Daniel, his son, had done well for himself, incredibly well. At 32, Daniel was a top executive at a financial firm, a man who spoke in millions and walked with the swagger of someone who believed he owned the world. Caleb remembered the days when Daniel was just a boy with scuffed knees, running through the pews, playing hide-and-seek behind the altar while Caleb prepared his sermons. Those days felt like a different lifetime now. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes, and with every mile, the scenery changed from the humble, close-knit neighborhood of Caleb's parish to the manicured lawns and iron gates of the upper class. When Caleb arrived at the gate, the security guard looked at his rusted sedan with a sneer before checking the guest list. Name, the guard backed, not bothering to look up. Reverend Caleb Williams, he said softly, clutching the steering wheel. I'm the groom's father. The guard paused, looked at the car, then back at the list, raising an eyebrow as if he couldn't reconcile the two facts. Go on through. Park in the back lot, the guard said dismissively, waving him through. Caleb swallowed his pride, parked where he was told, and walked toward the crystal-adorned marquee where the ceremony would take place. The venue was breathtaking, filled with white roses, imported silk ribbons, and guests who wore suits that cost more than Caleb's annual salary. He felt small, invisible, like a ghost haunting a feast he wasn't invited to. He found his seat in the second row, not the first. The front row was reserved for the bride's family and Daniel's business partners. That stung, a sharp prick to his heart, but Caleb told himself it was just a mistake, an oversight in the chaos of wedding planning. He sat down, placing his worn Bible on his lap, the leather cover soft from decades of use. He had marked a passage to read, a special blessing he had written just for Daniel and his bride, Jessica. Jessica was a beautiful woman, sharp and ambitious, but she had always looked at Caleb with a mixture of pity and amusement, as if he were a quaint relic of a bygone era. The music swelled, a dramatic orchestral piece that signaled the start of the ceremony. Daniel walked down the aisle, and Caleb's heart swelled with love. His boy looked like a prince, tall and handsome, in a tuxedo that fitted him perfectly. Caleb caught his son's eye and smiled, offering a small, hopeful wave. Daniel's eyes flickered over his father for a split second, cold and unrecognized, before he turned his gaze forward toward the altar. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement, just a blank stare that chilled Caleb to the bone. The ceremony was quick, efficient, and entirely devoid of God. There were no prayers, no scriptures, just a celebrant talking about partnership and synergy. Caleb respected their choice, even if it pained him, but he held on to the hope of the reception. Daniel had promised him weeks ago, "Dad, you can say a few words at the dinner. Keep it short, but you can speak." That promise was the lifeline Caleb was holding on to. The reception was held in a massive ballroom with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. The noise was deafening, laughter and clinking glasses mixing with the heavy bass of the music. Caleb sat at a table near the kitchen doors, far from the head table where Daniel and Jessica held like royalty. He ate the fancy food without tasting it, his hand resting on his Bible, rehearsing the words of love and wisdom he wanted to share. Finally, the best man clinked his glass and the room quieted. Speeches began. The best man told raunchy stories about bachelor parties that made Caleb blush. The maid of honor spoke about shopping trips in Paris. Everyone laughed and cheered. Then there was a lull. The master of ceremonies looked at his list. Caleb stood up slowly, his knees aching. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked toward the stage. He saw Daniel stiffen. He saw Jessica whisper something urgently in Daniel's ear. Caleb reached the microphone, his heart pounding. The room went silent, but it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of awkward tension. "Good evening, everyone," Caleb began, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "For those who don't know me, I am Caleb, Daniel's father. I remember the day this young man was born, how I held him in my arms and prayed that he would be a man of integrity and love." He opened his Bible, his fingers finding the bookmark. "I wanted to share a verse that has guided our family for generations." Suddenly, the sound of a chair scraping loudly against the floor echoed through the hall. Daniel was standing up. He wasn't smiling. He looked furious. He stormed up the stairs to the stage, his polished shoes thudding ominously under the sounds of the guests' gasps. He didn't wait for Caleb to finish. He reached out and snatched the microphone from his father's hand with such force that the feedback screeched, causing guests to cover their ears. "That's enough," Daniel snapped, his voice booming through the speakers, distorted and angry. Caleb stood there, his empty hand still raised, the Bible clutching in the other. "Daniel," he whispered, confused, "Son, I just wanted to bless you." Daniel turned on him, his face twisted with a mixture of embarrassment and disdain. "We don't need your blessings, old man," Daniel said, and he didn't lower the microphone. He wanted everyone to hear. "Look at you. You walk in here with your cheap suit and your fairy tales, embarrassing me in front of my investors, in front of my friends." The room gasped. A few people chuckled nervously, but most watched in stunned silence. "I told you to keep it short," Daniel hissed, stepping closer, towering over his father. "But you can't help yourself, can you? You always have to make it about you and your little church. Well, let me tell you something, Dad. Your prayers didn't pay for this wedding. My work did. Your God didn't buy this champagne. I did." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces that were now judging him, mocking him. "Son, please," Caleb said, his voice barely audible without the mic. "I love you." "If you loved me," Daniel shouted, pointing a finger at Caleb's chest, "you would have stayed in your corner and kept your mouth shut. You're a relic, Dad. You and your poverty and your Bible. You don't fit in my world. You never have. I invited you out of pity, and you turned it into a circus." Jessica was laughing now, a cruel, high-pitched sound from the head table. Daniel turned back to the crowd, flashing a charming, fake smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive my father. He's confused. He thinks he's in the pulpit, but he's just a senile old man who doesn't know when to sit down." Daniel turned back to Caleb, his face dead. "Get out. Go home. You've done enough damage." Caleb stood frozen for a heartbeat, the humiliation burning his skin like acid. He looked at the son he had prayed for, the son he had sacrificed everything for, and saw a stranger. Slowly, with a dignity that silenced the room more than any shout could have, Caleb closed his Bible. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in finality. He turned and walked down the stairs. The long walk to the exit felt like a march to the gallows. He could feel the eyes on his back, the whispers, the snickers. He didn't look back. He walked out of the ballroom, through the heavy oak doors, and into the cool night air. It had started to rain, a gentle drizzle that mingled with the tears finally spilling down his cheeks. The drive back to the rectory that night was the longest journey Caleb had ever made, though the physical distance was less than 30 miles. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, hammering against the roof of his sedan, as if the heavens themselves were weeping in solidarity with the broken man behind the wheel. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth in a frantic rhythm, fighting a losing battle against the deluge, much like Caleb had fought for his relationship with Daniel. Every time the blades cleared the glass, the darkness returned instantly, swallowing the road ahead. When he finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the church, the headlights cut through the gloom to illuminate the peeling white paint of the sanctuary door. It looked small, fragile, and incredibly lonely. Caleb sat in the idling car for a long time, the engine sputtering, his hands still gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He was afraid to go inside. Inside meant silence. Inside meant facing the reality that he was truly, utterly alone. Hello friends, and welcome back to the story. It is often said that time heals all wounds, but sometimes time just gives us more space to mourn. Before we continue with the heartbreaking years that followed, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Is it the busy streets of Mumbai, the quiet hills of Kentucky, or perhaps the sunny coast of Australia? We love to see our global family. Caleb finally turned off the engine, plunging the world into silence, save for the drumming rain. He stepped out, not bothering to run for cover, letting the cold water soak into the cheap suit that Daniel had mocked. He walked into the rectory, the house where he had raised his son, the house that used to be filled with the sounds of a boy's laughter and the smell of Sunday roast. Now, it smelled of old paper and dust. Caleb walked to his bedroom, stripped off the wetsuit, and folded it carefully. Despite the humiliation, despite the way Daniel had looked at it with such disgust, Caleb couldn't bring himself to throw it on the floor. He hung it in the back of his closet, pushing it behind his heavy winter coat, burying the memory of the wedding day in the dark. That night, Caleb knelt by his bed, but for the first time in 40 years, he couldn't find the words to pray. He just knelt there, his forehead resting on the cool sheets, listening to the thunder rattle the window panes, waiting for a peace that didn't come. The weeks turned into months, and the months bled into years. The silence from Daniel was absolute. In the first year, Caleb wrote letters. He sat at his small oak desk every Tuesday evening, penning long, heartfelt notes. He didn't preach, and he didn't scold. He wrote about the weather, about Mrs. Higgins's cat getting stuck in the tree again, about the leaks in the church roof. He wrote about how much he loved Daniel. He mailed them to Daniel's office address, the only one he could find online. Every single letter came back 3 weeks later, stamped with a red return to sender ink that looked like a wound on the envelope. After the 12th letter came back unopened, Caleb stopped writing. He placed the stack of returned envelopes in a shoebox under his bed, a graveyard of unread words. 5 years passed. The world moved on, faster and louder. The neighborhood around Caleb's church began to change. The modest family homes were being bought up by developers, torn down and replaced with gleaming glass condos that towered over the little white chapel. The community that Caleb had served for decades was being priced out, scattered to the winds. His congregation dwindled. Funerals became more frequent than baptisms. The Sunday collection plate, once enough to keep the lights on and the food pantry stocked, now barely covered the cost of heating oil. Caleb grew thinner, his hair turning completely white, his walk becoming a slow shuffle, but he kept the doors open. He preached to the 12 or 15 faithful souls who remained, his voice raspy but his spirit unbroken. He refused to let the light go out, even as the shadows lengthened. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Daniel's star was rising with meteoric speed. He had become a partner at his firm, his face gracing the covers of business magazines under headlines like The Shark of Wall Street and The New King of Capital. They had moved into a penthouse that looked down on the clouds. They drove imported cars and vacationed on private islands where the water was turquoise and the sand was white sugar. To the outside world, Daniel had it all, but inside the glass walls of his life, the air was thin and cold. Jessica was insatiable. The more money Daniel made, the more she spent, and the more she demanded. Their conversations weren't about love or dreams, they were about acquisitions, status, and image. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whom Caleb only knew about because a parishioner brought him a clipped newspaper article with a photo of Daniel's family at a charity gala. Daniel looked powerful in the photo, his jaw set, his eyes hard. He didn't look happy. He looked hungry. By the 8th year, the disconnect was total. Daniel had effectively erased his past. In interviews, when asked about his background, he would say he was a self-made man who pulled himself up from nothing, conveniently omitting the father who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his private tutors and college tuition. He omitted the prayers that had covered him. He omitted the love that was his foundation. He began to believe his own lie, that he owed nothing to anyone. His arrogance grew into a reckless God complex. He started taking bigger risks, cutting corners, stepping on anyone who got in his way. He felt untouchable. He had forgotten the scripture Caleb used to quote, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Then came the 10th year, the year everything would change. It started with a letter, but not one from Caleb. It was a letter delivered to the church by a courier in a dark suit when Caleb was sweeping the front steps as the autumn leaves swirled around his ankles, when the man approached and handed him a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the logo of Vanguard Development Group. Caleb's hands shook as he opened it. It was a formal offer to purchase the church land. The amount offered was staggering, more money than the church had seen in a century. But as Caleb read further, his heart stopped. The letter wasn't just an offer, it was a threat. It detailed that the surrounding properties had already been acquired and that the church was now the only obstacle preventing the construction of a massive luxury shopping complex. It subtly hinted at eminent domain, at legal battles the church couldn't afford, at the inevitability of their erasure. Caleb turned the page to see the signature at the bottom. There, signed in aggressive, sharp strokes of black ink, was the name, Daniel Williams, CEO. Caleb dropped the letter. It fluttered to the concrete steps like a dying bird. His son wasn't just ignoring him anymore. His son was coming to destroy the only thing Caleb had left. Daniel didn't just want to forget his father. He wanted to bulldoze the very altar where he had been baptized. He wanted to turn the house of God into a parking lot for a shopping mall. Caleb looked up at the sky, gray and heavy with impending snow, and felt a strange sensation. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was a sudden, fierce clarity. For 10 years, he had been the mourning father, the passive victim of his son's cruelty. But this was an attack on God's house. This was a war for the soul of his community. Caleb picked up the letter, his grip tightening until the paper crinkled. He walked back inside the church, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards, but they didn't sound like the shuffle of an old man anymore. They sounded like the march of a soldier. He walked to the pulpit, placed the letter on the lectern, and looked at the empty pews. "You want a fight, Daniel," he whispered to the silence. "Then you shall have one." The time of weeping was over, the time for the harvest. The glass walls of Daniel Williams's corner office on the 45th floor offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a sprawling grid of steel and concrete that he liked to believe he conquered every single morning. From this height, the people down below were nothing more than ants, scurrying about their insignificant lives, while he sat in the clouds, a titan of industry. He swiveled his Italian leather chair away from the window and looked at the architectural model sitting on his mahogany desk. It was a miniature replica of the Oak Haven complex, a futuristic shopping and residential hub that was poised to be his legacy. It was perfect, gleaming white plastic and miniature trees, except for one glaring problem: the plot of land right in the center, currently occupied by a rotting wooden structure that refused to sell, his father's church. Daniel clenched his jaw, the muscles feathering with irritation. He had offered the old man 3 times the market value. It was more money than Caleb could spend in 10 lifetimes. It was generous. It was merciful. And yet, the rejection letter sitting on his desk was written on cheap, yellowing paper with a stubbornness that made Daniel want to scream. He picked up the letter again, reading the single sentence written in Caleb's shaky handwriting. "This house belongs to the Lord, and it is not for sale." Daniel crumbled the paper in his fist and threw it into the trash can. He checked his Rolex. He had investors breathing down his neck, leverage ratios that were dangerously high, and a board of directors that was growing impatient. He didn't have time for sentimental nonsense. He needed that land, and he needed it yesterday. Hello friends, welcome back to part 3 of our story. Things are about to get intense as the past and present collide. Before we see what happens when Daniel confronts his father, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in the snowy streets of Toronto, the humid heat of Singapore, or the bustling avenues of Berlin? Let us know. Daniel buzzed his secretary, his voice clipped and cold. "Cancel my afternoon meetings, I'm going out." He grabbed his coat and headed for the private elevator, his mind racing with strategies. If money wouldn't buy the old man, intimidation would. Daniel hadn't spoken to his father in 10 years, not since that night at the wedding, and honestly, he hadn't missed him. He viewed his father as a symbol of everything he hated: weakness, poverty, and a reliance on a God who, in his eyes, never paid the bills. Daniel believed in the God of the market, the God of compound interest, the God of the deal. As he drove his sleek black sports car toward the old neighborhood, the smooth jazz on the stereo did little to calm his nerves. The neighborhood had changed, just as the report said. High-rise condos cast long shadows over the few remaining row houses. The streets were cleaner, the cars newer. But then he turned the corner onto Elm Street, and there it was, the First Grace Chapel. It looked exactly the same as it had when he was a child, only sadder. The white paint was graying and peeling in long strips like dead skin. The stained glass window above the door was cracked and taped over. It looked like a sore thumb in the middle of a gentrified hand. Daniel parked his six-figure car right in front of the steps, blocking the entrance, a deliberate power move. He stepped out, straightening his designer suit, and walked up the steps. The wood groaned under his weight, a sound that triggered a flash of memory, running up these steps for choir practice. But he shoved it down. He wasn't that boy anymore. He pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the sanctuary. The air inside was cool and smelled of beeswax and old hymnals, a scent so familiar it made Daniel's stomach turn. The sanctuary was empty, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light filtering through the windows. And there, at the front, kneeling at the altar rail with a rag in his hand, was Caleb. He looked older than Daniel remembered, much older. His frame was frail, his shoulders hunched, his hair a thin wisp of white cotton. He was polishing the communion rail, a task he must have done 1,000 times. Daniel's shoes clicked loudly on the hardwood floor as he marched down the central aisle. Caleb didn't turn around. "I told you, the answer is no," Caleb said, his voice raspy but steady, echoing slightly in the empty space. Daniel stopped 3 rows back. "You haven't even heard the new offer, Dad," Daniel said, the word dad tasting like vinegar in his mouth. Caleb slowly stood up, using the rail for support. He turned around, and for the first time in a decade, father and son looked at each other. Daniel expected to see anger or fear in Caleb's eyes. Instead, he saw a profound sadness that was far more unsettling. "I don't need to hear the offer, Daniel. You cannot buy what is not yours to sell. This ground is consecrated." Daniel let out a short, harsh laugh. "Consecrated? Look around you. The roof is leaking. The pews are rotting. There's nobody here. You're preaching to ghosts. I'm offering you a way out, a retirement home in Florida, dignity. Why are you being so stubborn?" Daniel walked closer, stepping into the chancel, invading the sacred space. "Do you know how much pressure I'm under? Do you have any idea what's at stake?" Caleb looked at his son, really looked at him, and shook his head. "I know exactly what is at stake. Your soul." Daniel rolled his eyes, pacing back and forth in front of the pulpit. "Don't start with the sermons. I'm not 12 years old. I'm a businessman. I have a contract to fulfill. If you don't sell, I'll petition the city. I'll declare the building condemned. I have lawyers who can tie you up in court until you're bankrupt. I will bulldoze this place with or without your permission." Caleb stood his ground, appearing taller than his physical stature. "You can knock down the wood and the stone, Daniel, but you cannot destroy the church. The church is the people, and as long as I have breath, I will stand here. But I must warn you." Caleb took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Daniel's with an intensity that made Daniel flinch. "I have been praying for you, Daniel, and the Lord showed me a vision last night. You are standing on a glass floor, and it is cracking." Daniel sneered, buttoning his jacket. "My floor is solid marble, old man. I'm untouchable. You have 1 week. 1 week to sign the papers, or I bring the wrecking ball myself." He turned on his heel and stormed out, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a strange vibration, a tremor in his hands that he couldn't explain. He told himself it was just rage. He burst out of the church doors, gasping for the fresh air, needing to get away from the suffocating weight of that place. He got into his car and slammed the door, revving the engine. As he pulled away, peeling rubber on the asphalt, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was his personal line, the one only 3 people had. He picked it up, expecting his wife or his lead counsel. "Williams?" he backed. There was a pause, and then a voice he didn't recognize spoke, a voice that was calm, professional, and terrifying. "Mr. Williams, this is Agent Miller from the Securities and Commission. We are executing a search warrant at your offices as we speak. We need you to come in for questioning regarding the Vanguard Development Funds." Daniel slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the street. The world suddenly tilted on its axis. "What?" he whispered, the blood draining from his face. That's impossible. My audits are clean." The agent's voice remained flat. "We have a whistleblower, Mr. Williams, a very credible one. Do not leave the city." The line went dead. Daniel sat there, the phone slipping from his sweaty fingers. He looked in the rearview mirror. The church was reflected there, small and white and unmoving. Caleb's words echoed in his mind. "You are standing on a glass floor and it is cracking." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. He was Daniel Williams. He was the king of capital. He couldn't go down, not now, not when he was so close. But as he looked at the church in the mirror, a chill went down his spine that he had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Karma wasn't just knocking, it had just kicked in the front door. And the man who had disgraced his father in the pursuit of gold was about to find out that gold melts when the fire gets hot enough. Daniel slammed his fist against the steering wheel, a scream of frustration tearing from his throat, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. The storm had arrived. The sirens were wailing, a chaotic symphony that seemed to be playing exclusively for Daniel Williams as he sped toward the financial district, weaving his black sports car through the gridlock traffic with reckless desperation. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and the cold sweat that had started at the church was now soaking through his dress shirt. When he finally screeched to a halt in front of the sleek glass tower that bore his firm's name, the scene that greeted him was a nightmare brought to life. Police cruisers and black government SUVs formed a barricade around the entrance, their lights flashing in a dizzying rhythm of red and blue that reflected off the wet pavement. Men in windbreakers with FBI and SEC emblazoned in yellow letters were marching out the revolving doors carrying boxes, white bankers' boxes filled with files, hard drives, and the shredded remains of Daniel's reputation. He sat frozen in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, unable to breathe, unable to look away from the dismantling of his empire. Hello friends, welcome back to part 4 of our story. As we watch the house of cards come tumbling down, we have to ask, do you believe in karma? Or do you think it's just coincidence? Before we witness Daniel's rock bottom, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in the bustling streets of Tokyo, the quiet countryside of Ireland, or the vibrant city of Cape Town? We love reading your answers. Daniel stumbled out of his car, his legs feeling like jelly, and tried to push through the line of reporters that had already gathered like vultures sensing a carcass. "Mr. Williams, is that true you embezzled millions? Daniel, are the rumors about the Ponzi scheme true?" The questions hit him like physical blows, each one stripping away a layer of his arrogance. He tried to storm past the police officer to get into the building, shouting, "I am the CEO, you can't do this." But the officer simply held up a hand and pushed him back. "Step back, sir. The building is a crime scene. You are not permitted entry." A crime scene. His life's work, his legacy, reduced to a crime scene. In that moment, he saw his reflection in the glass doors, disheveled, wild-eyed, panic-stricken, and he remembered his father's words, "You are standing on a glass floor and it is cracking." The crack had just become a chasm and he was falling. His phone buzzed again. It was the bank. His personal accounts were frozen. His credit cards were declined. The assets he had bragged about, the liquid capital he had taunted his father with, had evaporated instantly under the heat of a federal freeze order. He was a billionaire on paper, but in reality, he didn't even have enough cash to buy a cup of coffee. Dazed and defeated, Daniel turned away from the building, shielding his face from the cameras, and got back into his car. He had to go home. He had to talk to Jessica. She would understand. They would figure this out. They had offshore accounts, hidden assets, contingency plans. They were a team. He drove to the penthouse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the car in the lane. When he burst through the front door of their luxury apartment, expecting to find a distraught wife waiting for comfort, he was met with a very different scene. Suitcases, Louis Vuitton trunks that cost more than his father's car, were stacked by the door. Jessica was standing in the foyer, dressed in a sharp trench coat, checking her phone with an air of impatience. The nanny was hurrying the children toward the elevator. "Jessica," Daniel gasped, breathless. "Thank God you're here. It's a mess downtown. They're freezing everything, but we can fight this. We just need to call the lawyers in the Caymans and..." Jessica looked up, and the look in her eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't fear. It wasn't love. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. "There is no we, Daniel," she said coldly, sliding her phone into her purse. "I'm filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and criminal negligence." Daniel stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Divorce? Now? Jessica, I'm losing everything. I need you." She laughed, a dry, brittle sound that echoed the way she had laughed at his father 10 years ago. I married a winner, Daniel. I married the shark of Wall Street. I didn't marry a felon who's about to spend the next 20 years in a federal prison. I'm taking the kids to my mother's in the Hamptons. Do not follow us. She signaled to the nanny, and without even a backward glance, she walked into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing Daniel in the tomb of his own making. He stood in the silent, empty penthouse, surrounded by expensive art and Italian furniture that no longer belonged to him. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. It didn't look like a kingdom anymore. It looked like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Over the next 3 days, the dismantling was absolute. His car was repossessed from the garage. The landlord served an eviction notice. His friends, the ones who drank his champagne and laughed at his jokes, stopped answering his calls. He was radioactive. On Sunday morning, Daniel found himself walking the streets, shivering in his suit jacket, which was now stained and wrinkled. He had nowhere to go, no money for a hotel, no friends to take him in. He was hungry, a gnawing, painful hunger he hadn't felt since he was a child before his father took on extra jobs. His feet, blistered in his Italian leather shoes, carried him without conscious thought. He walked past the skyscrapers, past the park, past the invisible line that separated the rich from the poor. He walked until he smelled the familiar scent of rain on dry asphalt. He looked up and realized where he was. The First Grace Chapel stood before him. The for sale sign he had planted in his mind was gone. Instead, the humble wooden sign reading "All are welcome" remained. It was Sunday service. He could hear the faint sound of a hymn drifting through the closed doors. Amazing grace. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He hesitated at the bottom of the steps. He was the enemy here. He was the man who had tried to bulldoze this sanctuary. He was the son who had publicly disgraced his father preaching inside. But he had nowhere else. His pride had been stripped away layer by painful layer until all that was left was a frightened boy who just wanted his father. Trembling, Daniel climbed the steps. The wood didn't groan the strength. It seemed to sigh under his weight. He reached out a shaking hand and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The sanctuary was warm and golden. The congregation was small, maybe 20 people, but their voices filled the room. And there, standing behind the pulpit, wearing a simple robe that had seen better days, was Reverend Caleb Williams. Caleb was in the middle of his sermon. He looked tired, his eyes heavy, but his voice was strong. Forgiveness, Caleb said, is not a feeling. It is a door we choose to open even when the storm is raging outside. The heavy door creaked as Daniel stepped inside, and the sound echoed through the quiet church. Heads turned, the singing stopped. A collective gasp rippled through the pews as the congregation recognized the man standing at the back of the church, the prodigal son, the enemy, the broken tycoon. Daniel stood there, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face, waiting for the judgment, waiting for the anger, waiting to be thrown out just as he had thrown his father out 10 years ago. He locked eyes with Caleb across the expanse of the sanctuary. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, a pendulum swinging between condemnation and grace. Caleb stopped speaking. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. He looked at the wreck of a man standing at the back of his church, the man who had mocked him, threatened him, and abandoned him. The entire church held its breath, waiting to see if the Reverend would finally unleash the wrath he was entitled to, or if the sermon on forgiveness was more than words. Daniel dropped to his knees, his head bowed, unable to bear the weight of his father's gaze, and sobbed, the sound breaking the holy silence of the room. The sound of Daniel's knees hitting the hard wooden floorboards echoed through the sanctuary like a gavel strike, signaling the end of his trial and the beginning of his judgment. He remained there, hunched over, his expensive suit stained with the filth of the streets and his shoulders heaving with sobs that he could no longer suppress. The congregation sat frozen, their eyes darting between the broken billionaire on the floor and the pastor standing in the pulpit. They knew the history. They knew the insults, the threats, the eviction notices. They expected righteous anger. They expected Reverend Caleb to point a finger and declare that justice had finally been served. Hello friends, we have reached the final chapter of this emotional journey. As we witness the ultimate collision of justice and mercy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you joining us from the mountains of Nepal, the plains of Kenya, or the suburbs of Chicago? We are so glad you are here. Caleb stared at his son, his heart hammering against his ribs. For 10 years, he had rehearsed this moment in his nightmares. In those dark dreams, Daniel would return to mock him one last time, or worse, to bulldoze the church while Caleb watched helplessly. But this shattered man weeping at the altar, this was not the victory of an enemy. It was the return of a lost child. Caleb slowly released his grip on the pulpit. He didn't speak a word of condemnation. He didn't quote a scripture about reaping what you sow, even though it would have been justified. Instead, he unbuttoned his robe, stepped down from the elevated platform, and began to walk down the center aisle. The silence was absolute, save for the sound of Caleb's footsteps and Daniel's ragged breathing. Caleb stopped in front of his son. He looked down at the man who had disgraced him at his wedding, the man who had called him a relic, the man who had tried to erase his legacy. Caleb saw the grime on Daniel's neck, the gray hairs that had appeared from stress, the total defeat in his posture. Slowly, painfully, Caleb knelt down on the hard floor beside him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't ask for an apology. He simply reached out and wrapped his arms around Daniel's shaking frame, pulling his son's head onto his shoulder, disregarding the dirt and the tears. "Dad," he choked out, his voice sounding like a small boy's. "I lost it all. I lost everything. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Caleb held him tighter, rocking him back and forth as he had done 30 years ago when Daniel had scraped his knee. "You haven't lost everything," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You lost your money. You lost your pride, but you found your way home. And as long as you are here, you have not lost your father." The congregation, witnessing this act of radical grace, began to weep. Someone in the back started singing softly, "I once was lost, but now I'm found." And soon the whole church joined in, a chorus of forgiveness washing over the prodigal son. But the world outside the church walls was not as forgiving as the father within the church. 2 hours later, as Daniel sat in the rectory kitchen eating a bowl of soup Caleb had made him, the police arrived. They didn't come with sirens this time. They came with a quiet, grim determination. Caleb walked Daniel to the door. He didn't try to stop the officers. He knew that grace covers sin, but it doesn't remove consequences. Daniel stood on the porch, his hands cuffed behind his back. He looked at his father, terror in his eyes. "Dad, I'm scared," he admitted. Caleb placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I know, son. You have a long road ahead. You broke laws and you hurt people. You must pay that debt. But hear me well, you will not walk that road alone. I will be there every visiting day. I will write to you every week. And when you walk out of those gates, I will be waiting." The trial was swift and brutal. Daniel pleaded guilty to all charges. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. The oak having project collapsed, the investors pulled out, and the company was dissolved. The land was safe, not because of a buyout, but because the developer was in a cell. Daniel was sent to a medium security facility 3 hours away. True to his word, Caleb was there every Saturday. For the first year, Daniel was angry and depressed. He mourned his jets and his penthouse, but slowly, stripped of the distractions of wealth, he began to read the Bible his father had mailed him, the same worn Bible Caleb had tried to read from at the wedding. In the silence of his cell, Daniel found something he never had in his corner office: peace. He started leading a Bible study for other inmates. He taught illiterate prisoners how to read. He stopped being the shark of Wall Street and started becoming Daniel Williams again. 8 years passed. The world changed again. Caleb was now 80 years old, frail and moving with a cane. On a bright Tuesday morning, he stood outside the heavy iron gates of the correctional facility, leaning against his old rusted sedan. The gates buzzed and slowly opened. A man walked out. He wasn't wearing an Italian suit. He wore simple jeans and a white t-shirt. He didn't have a Rolex. He carried a plastic bag with his few belongings. But he stood tall, his eyes clear and bright. Daniel saw his father and broke into a run, dropping his bag and engulfing the old man in a hug that nearly knocked them both over. "Dad, you waited," Daniel said, tears in his eyes. "I told you I would," Caleb replied, patting his back. "Let's go home." The return to the church was not a triumphant parade, but a quiet restoration. Daniel didn't try to take over. He didn't try to modernize the service or buy new equipment. Instead, he took the job of the janitor. Every morning, the former CEO swept the floors, polished the pews, and fixed the leaky roof with his own hands. He mowed the lawn and painted the siding. He served the community that he had once tried to evict. One Sunday, 10 years after that fateful wedding, Daniel stood at the pulpit, not to preach,
but to share a testimony. He looked out at the congregation, his hands resting on the wood he had once threatened to destroy. "I used to think my father was a failure," Daniel said, his voice strong and humble. "I thought he was weak because he was poor. I thought he was foolish because he chose service over profit. I disgraced him because I was blind to the true nature of wealth." He looked down at Caleb, who was sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. "But I learned the hard way that a man is not measured by the size of his bank account, but by the size of his heart. I built a tower of glass and it shattered. My father built a foundation of rock and it stood. Karma knocked me down, yes, it took everything I had, but grace picked me up." Daniel walked down and sat beside his father. The church wasn't rich. The roof still needed patches sometimes, but it was full. It was full of love, full of redemption, and full of peace. And as the organ music swelled, filling the little white chapel with a joyful noise, Caleb Williams closed his eyes and smiled. He had lost his son to the world, but he had won him back for eternity. The harvest had come, and it was bountiful. Thank you for watching our story. If this tale touched your heart, please share it with a friend who needs a reminder that it's never too late to come home. Until next time, stay blessed.